Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Inquisition Tower at Carcassonne. In the walled city of Carcassonne, in the south of France, a narrow stone tower rises above the ramparts that most tourists walk straight past. During the 13th and 14th centuries, this tower served as a holding prison for men and women accused of heresy during the campaign against the Cathars. A Christian sect, the Catholic Church, had declared a threat to be exterminated. The accused were brought here to wait, sometimes for months, while inquisitors decided whether they would recant, be released, or be burned. Before we continue, if you enjoy real historical mysteries and forgotten places like these, make sure you're subscribed. By the time we reach number 1, you'll understand why this list only gets more disturbing. The walls of that tower are still covered in what they left behind. Crosses scratched into the stone by hand, some crude, some carefully proportioned, appear by the dozens in the lower chambers. Alongside them are symbols that don't match any standard religious iconography of the period, shapes historians still cannot fully explain, mixed among Latin fragments so worn that only a few letters remain legible. Restoration work carried out on the tower in recent decades used raking light, angled beams that catch shallow grooves invisible under normal lighting, and revealed dozens more carvings that had gone unnoticed for 7 centuries. What makes the Carcassonne graffiti particularly unsettling isn't the crosses themselves. It's the density of them, layered on top of each other in the same small patches of wall, as though successive prisoners kept returning to the exact same spot to add their own mark beside the ones already there. Conservators have identified at least 3 distinct carving styles in a single square meter of stone, suggesting the wall functioned as something between a shrine and a message board, a place where each new prisoner read what the last one left before adding to it. Some of the marks are dated using tool analysis to decades apart, meaning whatever tradition drove people to carve in that specific corner of the tower survived the deaths of the individuals who started it, passed down, through nothing but the physical evidence itself. Nobody explained the ritual to the next prisoner. There was no manual. Someone simply looked at the wall, understood what they were seeing, and continued it. Local records from the period, fragmentary as they are, mention at least one prisoner who spent 11 months in the tower before his case was resolved. 11 months in a stone room barely large enough to lie down in, with nothing to do but wait, and, apparently, carve. Historians studying the marks have noted that the deepest, most careful crosses appear in the areas of the wall reachable while seated, at exactly the height a person chained by the ankle to a ring in the floor could reach without standing. The chains are long gone. The ring is still there. The truly disturbing part is what the marks don't say. Unlike later prisons, where graffiti frequently includes names, dates, or pleas for mercy, almost none of the Carcassonne carvings identify who made them. Entire lives, entire trials that likely ended in execution, are represented only by an anonymous cross scratched at exactly arm's length from an iron ring. Whoever they were, they chose not to leave a name. They left a symbol instead, over and over, as if the symbol mattered more than being remembered. Excavation of the tower's lower level in the 1990s uncovered a sealed chamber beneath the main holding cell, accessible only through a narrow shaft, containing no light source and no visible ventilation. Scratches on the shaft walls, made by fingernails rather than tools, run in a pattern consistent with someone repeatedly reaching upward toward the opening. Nobody has determined how long that chamber was used, or how many people were lowered into it and never brought back up. Number 9. The vaults beneath Edinburgh Castle Deep, under the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, sits a network of storage vaults that, for a period stretching from the 1780s into the early 1800s, was repurposed as a prison for enemy combatants captured during Britain's wars with France and, briefly, the United States. Thousands of prisoners of war passed through these chambers over roughly 3 decades. Sailors and soldiers held in conditions so cramped that men reportedly slept in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at once. The vaults were sealed and forgotten for most of the 20th century, used for mundane storage until restoration work, beginning in the 1990s, stripped back layers of later brickwork and revealed what the walls had been hiding. Carved into the stone and into the surviving wooden doors was an entire hidden record of the men who had been kept there. Ships under full sail, guillotines, gallows, initials paired with dates. A crude but unmistakable depiction of a hanging figure, carved by someone who may have been watching his own fate approach. What makes the Edinburgh vaults particularly disturbing is the specificity of some of the imagery. One carved ship, identified by naval historians through its rigging details, appears to match a vessel that was part of a documented prisoner transport, meaning whoever carved it was recreating, from memory, the exact ship that had brought him across the channel into captivity. Another door bears a carving of a coat of arms that researchers eventually traced to a French naval family, suggesting an officer held below decks in a fortress prison found a way to assert an identity the war had otherwise stripped from him. Analysis of tool marks on the doors indicates the carvings were made with makeshift implements, sharpened bone fragments, and bent nails, since prisoners were not permitted knives. Some sections of wood show evidence of carvings that were deliberately gouged out and reworked, as though a design was altered mid-process, perhaps out of fear the image was too incriminating or too honest to leave intact. Bone remnants found during the same restoration, worked into small dice, buttons, and tokens, indicate prisoners maintained an underground economy inside the vaults, gambling and trading objects they carved themselves in total darkness, lit only by the little oil light guards allowed. Several of the carved doors are covered in tally marks running into the hundreds, counts whose purpose nobody has been able to reconstruct. Days survived, meals withheld, executions witnessed through a grate. The vaults offer no explanation, only the number. The truly haunting aspect of the Edinburgh vaults is how ordinary the men who left these marks actually were. Ship's carpenters, junior officers, teenage conscripts barely old enough to hold a musket, reduced to a windowless stone room under a castle. In a war most of them had no say in starting, their only lasting legacy the width of a fingernail scratch and the depth of a bent nail dragged across oak. Some of those doors are now behind protective glass. Visitors can stand inches from carvings made by men whose names, in most cases, were never recorded anywhere else. Number 8. The Donjon of Château de Chillon. On the shore of Lake Geneva, in Switzerland, stands Château de Chillon, a moated fortress whose lowest chamber, cut directly into the rock the castle sits on, held political and religious prisoners for centuries under the House of Savoy. The most famous of them, François Bonnevar, a prior and political dissident, was chained to one of the pillars supporting the vaulted ceiling for roughly 4 years in the 16th century. Able to move only the short radius the chain allowed him around the base of the stone, Bonnevard's imprisonment became legend 2 centuries later when Lord Byron visited the dungeon and, according to the story most often told, carved his own name into the same pillar Bonnevard had been chained to, inspired to write an entire poem about the ordeal after standing in the exact spot. That carving still exists, protected now behind a small barrier, and it draws visitors who come specifically to see a 19th century poet's signature scratched onto a 16th century prisoner's chain post. What makes Chillon particularly unsettling is everything visitors don't come to see. Byron's carving is famous precisely because it has a name attached to a known historical figure, but the same pillars and the surrounding walls of the dungeon are covered in dozens of other names, initials, and dates carved by prisoners who left no other trace in any historical record. Names that match no known trial documents, dates that correspond to no surviving case file. People who existed only long enough to be chained to stone, and to scratch proof of that existence into the pillar beside them, before vanishing from every other record that might have explained who they were. Conservators cataloging the dungeon walls have identified carving depths and tool marks, suggesting the practice continued across a span of more than 200 years, meaning prisoners held in completely different centuries, under different rulers, speaking different dialects, were nonetheless drawn to the exact same handful of pillars to leave the exact same kind of mark. Nobody instructed them to do this. There was no guard pointing new arrivals toward the correct pillar. Each prisoner, independently, arrived at the same instinct to press something sharp into stone and prove they had been there. Lake water seeps into the lower dungeon during periods of high water level, and several of the carvings sit at a height that would place them at or below the current waterline during flood seasons, meaning some names were carved by prisoners standing in water that would eventually rise past their own chests. The chamber floor itself shows evidence of periodic flooding stretching back centuries, adding cold, rising water to cold stone, darkness, and chains as part of what these prisoners endured while they carved. The truly disturbing implication of Chillon is what the anonymous names represent next to the famous one. Byron's signature draws crowds because his story survived, but the wall around it is a monument to everyone whose story didn't. Dozens of people who suffered through the same darkness, the same chains, the same rising water, and left the same instinctive mark, only to be remembered by nobody at all except as an unidentified scratch beside a poet's name 200 years later. Number 7. The Martelet Dungeon at the Royal Fortress of Loches. Inside the Fortress of Loches in central France sits a tower known as the Martelet, used for centuries to hold prisoners considered too dangerous or too politically valuable to execute outright. Among them was Ludovico Sforza, once Duke of Milan, one of the most powerful men in Renaissance Italy, captured by French forces in 1500 and imprisoned in a cell within this tower for the final 8 years of his life. Sforza was not held in a bare stone box. His cell, deep underground with no natural light, still bears the remains of an extraordinary set of wall paintings, believed to have been created by Sforza himself using pigments he prepared from whatever materials he could obtain in captivity. Stars cover the ceiling in painted constellations. Suns and geometric patterns spread across the walls in a dense, almost obsessive repetition, alongside fragments of text and symbols that art historians have spent decades trying to fully interpret. What makes the Martelet particularly disturbing is the psychological trajectory visible in the paintings themselves. Early sections, presumed to be from the first years of his confinement, are relatively ordered, careful compositions with recognizable astronomical symbolism reflecting a man who still had access to books and correspondence and clung to intellectual structure. Sections that believed to date from later years grow denser, more repetitive, patterns layered directly over earlier patterns, as though the walls simply ran out of room, and the compulsion to keep painting did not. Sforza died in that cell in 1508, having never been released, negotiated for, or ransomed, despite years of diplomatic maneuvering by his family. He spent nearly a decade painting an entire cosmos onto the walls of a room he would never leave. A private universe, rendered in whatever pigment a deposed duke could scrape together underground, for an audience that would not exist until archaeologists rediscovered the chamber, centuries later. Restoration work on the cell during the 20th century revealed layers of paint beneath the visible surface, meaning some sections were painted over and repainted multiple times, the wall used as a canvas again and again rather than expanded onto fresh stone. Whether this reflects an artistic revision process or something closer to compulsive repetition, researchers still debate. What isn't disputed is the sheer volume of labor represented, thousands of individual brushstrokes applied by lamplight or no light at all, in a cell whose prisoner had every reason to believe nobody would ever see the result. Other cells within the same tower complex, used to hold less prominent prisoners across later centuries, contain simpler carvings, names and dates scratched into stone rather than painted onto plaster, but positioned in the same pattern, clustered near where a chained prisoner's hand could reach. The Martelet held state prisoners for roughly 300 years after Sforza's death, and successive generations of the imprisoned appear to have followed the same basic instinct he did, filling the emptiness of the walls with whatever they could make with their hands, regardless of whether pigment or blade was available to them. The truly haunting aspect of Loches is the audience problem. Sfor painted an entire private cosmology onto the walls of a cell, specifically because there was nothing else to do and no one left to write to. He wasn't decorating a home he expected to return to. He was filling the only space he had left with the only thing still fully his own mind, projected onto stone, in a room where the only other resident was time. Number 6. The Beauchamp Tower at the Tower of London. Within the Tower of London complex stands the Beauchamp Tower, used from the 14th century onward to hold prisoners of high enough status to avoid the general cells, but not high enough to avoid imprisonment altogether. Political dissidents, religious recusants, and men caught on the wrong side of Tudor succession disputes were held here for months or years, and many of them carved directly into the stone walls of their cells, producing what is now considered one of the most extensive surviving collections of prisoner graffiti anywhere in Europe. The carvings range from simple initials to elaborate heraldic devices carved with genuine skill, suggesting some prisoners had access to proper tools, likely supplied by sympathetic guards or purchased outright, since wealth did not disappear simply because a man was imprisoned. One of the most studied carvings depicts a bear and a ragged staff, the heraldic badge of the Dudley family, surrounded by flowers, oak leaves, roses, honeysuckle, and gillyflowers. Each flower believed to represent one of the imprisoned Dudley brothers, held in the Tower, following their involvement in the failed plot to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne in 1553. What makes the Beauchamp Tower particularly unsettling is what happened to the men who made these carvings. The Dudley brothers' carving still exists in remarkable detail, a father's coded message of family unity etched into stone by men who had every reason to believe they would be executed within weeks. One of them, Guildford Dudley, married to Jane Grey herself, was in fact executed shortly after. His wife beheaded the same year. Both of their names now permanently associated with a carving meant to symbolize survival rather than the death that actually followed. Elsewhere in the tower, a carving reading simply I Ain has drawn centuries of speculation, believed by some historians to reference Jane Grey directly, carved by a prisoner connected to her brief and disastrous 9-day reign. The identity of who actually carved it, and precisely why, remains unresolved, a single word scratched into stone that has outlived every document that might once have explained it. Further carvings throughout the tower include astrological symbols, Latin mottos invoking patience and faith under suffering, and in at least one case, a fully rendered clock face, carved perhaps to track the passage of days in a cell with no other way to measure time. Some inscriptions include specific dates that allow historians to cross-reference known prisoners against the tower's occupancy records, confirming exact identities. Others remain entirely anonymous, initials with no surviving record to match them to. Conservation surveys conducted in recent decades using digital imaging have identified faint traces of carvings previously invisible to the naked eye, layered beneath centuries of later graffiti added by tourists and staff, meaning the tower's walls likely contain even more Tudor-era prisoner marks than currently catalogued, hidden under the noise of everyone who came after. The truly disturbing aspect of the Beauchamp Tower is the deliberateness behind so many of the carvings. These were not desperate scratches made in panic. Many show planning, symmetry, and craftsmanship. Men facing execution who nonetheless took the time to design something meant to last, understanding on some level that stone would outlive them and might eventually speak for them when nothing else could. Number 5. The Pozzetto cell at San Leo Fortress. Perched on an isolated rock outcrop in northern Italy, the Fortress of San Leo held one of the most notorious prisoners of the 18th century, the occultist and self-styled Count Alessandro Cagliostro, arrested by the Roman Inquisition in 1789 and transferred to San Leo in 1791 to serve a life sentence for heresy and Freemasonry. His cell, nicknamed the Pozzetto, or Little Well, was specifically engineered to prevent escape and to prevent communication with the outside world, accessible only through a trapdoor in the ceiling, with no door, no window, and food lowered down on a rope. Cagliostro spent the final 4 years of his life in that cell, isolated from nearly all human contact, and died there in 1795 under circumstances that remain disputed. What survives inside the cell, faint but still visible under close inspection, are marks that later visitors and researchers have interpreted as attempts at writing, made without ink or proper tools, using whatever residue Cagliostro could produce from food, soot, or his own body, applied directly to the stone in patterns that some scholars believe represent alchemical or Masonic symbolism he was known to have practiced before his arrest. What makes San Leo particularly disturbing is the totality of the isolation the cell was built to enforce. Unlike most dungeons, which held multiple prisoners within earshot of each other, The Pozzetto was designed as a single occupancy trap, specifically to prevent Cagliostro from communicating with anyone, guard included, beyond the minimum necessary to keep him alive. A man famous for his ability to move through the highest courts of Europe, to charm, to persuade, to build entire secret networks of followers, was reduced to a stone hole with a trapdoor, his only remaining audience the walls themselves. Church records from the period document repeated formal orders to prevent Cagliostro from obtaining writing materials of any kind, a restriction historians interpret as a direct response to his reputation, the Inquisition apparently as afraid of what he might write as of anything he might do. If that fear was justified, the marks that remain on the cell walls may be the closest thing that exists to Cagliostro's actual final testimony, a message the church spent 4 years actively trying to prevent him from leaving behind, made anyway using nothing but his own resourcefulness and whatever substance he had access to in a completely sealed room. Later examination of the trapdoor mechanism itself found scratch marks around its edges, consistent with repeated attempts to force or pick the lock from below. Evidence that Cagliostro did not simply accept his isolation, but tested the boundaries of it for years, likely long after any realistic hope of escape had faded, an act that speaks less to strategy than to the simple refusal to stop trying. The truly haunting aspect of San Leo is how effectively the isolation worked. Cagliostro died largely forgotten by the outside world that had once been fascinated by him, his final years so completely sealed off that even sympathetic biographers writing decades later had almost nothing firsthand to draw on beyond second-hand church reports. Whatever he actually wrote on those walls in his final years was, by design, meant for no one. It has taken more than 2 centuries and modern imaging equipment for anyone to even attempt reading it. Number 4. The cells of Špilberk Castle. Above the city of Brno, in the modern Czech Republic, sits Špilberk Castle, converted by the Habsburg monarchy into one of the harshest state prisons in the Austrian Empire, reserved specifically for political prisoners considered too dangerous to hold anywhere closer to the imperial capital. Among those held here in the 1820s was Silvio Pellico, an Italian writer and revolutionary, sentenced to 15 years for his involvement in secret societies pushing for Italian independence, sent to Špilberk's lowest, dampest cells, specifically because the conditions there were understood to be a slower form of execution. Pellico survived, was eventually released, and wrote a memoir of his imprisonment that became one of the most widely read political texts of its era, exposing conditions inside the fortress in enough detail that the book itself is credited by some historians with damaging the reputation of Austrian rule in Italy more than any single military defeat. But the memoir, powerful as it is, describes only what one prisoner chose to remember. What remains on the actual cell walls of Špilberk tells a different, quieter story that the book never fully captured. Restoration teams working through the fortress's lower levels have cataloged extensive carvings across multiple cells, names, dates, short phrases in Italian, Polish, and Hungarian, reflecting the range of nationalities the Habsburg authorities imprisoned here across decades of political unrest throughout the empire. What makes Špilberk particularly unsettling is the sheer density of documented human suffering condensed into such a small physical space, cell after cell containing evidence of separate individuals, separate causes, separate failed uprisings, all funneled into the same fortress because it had been specifically designed to be as miserable as possible. Some of the carvings include crude calendars, tally marks grouped in sets, believed to track either days served or, in at least one documented case, months between family letters that were permitted only rarely and heavily censored when they arrived at all. One cell contains a carved outline that conservators believe represents a rough map, possibly of the prisoner's home region, scratched from memory by someone who had no reasonable expectation of ever seeing it again. Medical records recovered from the fortress archives describe extraordinarily high mortality rates among prisoners held in the lowest cells, damp stone chambers where sunlight rarely reached and heating was minimal even in the harshest winters. Pellico's own memoir describes fellow prisoners dying slowly of illnesses the cold conditions made inevitable, and the carvings that survive in those same cells, made by men who in many cases did not live to be released, function as the only remaining record of who exactly passed through rooms. Official Habsburg documentation often failed to name in full. The truly disturbing aspect of Špilberk is the deliberate cruelty behind its design. This wasn't a dungeon repurposed by circumstance. It was a fortress specifically selected and modified by imperial authorities, because its conditions were known in advance to be lethal, a punishment engineered to look like imprisonment while functioning for many of the men held there, as something closer to a very slow, very cold execution, one carved wall at a time. Number 3. The Piombi cells of the Doge's palace. Beneath the lead roofing of the Doge Palace in Venice, a series of prison cells, known as the Piombi, meaning the leads, held prisoners of the Venetian Republic in conditions defined by extreme temperature swings, freezing in winter, and unbearably hot in summer. The lead roof directly above the cells, absorbing and radiating heat with nowhere for it to escape. Among the most famous prisoners ever held here was Giacomo Casanova, imprisoned in 1755 on charges of impiety and Freemasonry, who spent roughly 15 months in the Piombi before executing one of the most celebrated prison escapes in European history. Casanova's own written account of his imprisonment and escape became widely read and is largely responsible for the Piombi's enduring fame. But the cells he described, and the roof he eventually cut through using a metal spike smuggled inside a religious book, held many other prisoners across the centuries whose names never made it into any memoir at all. Wall surfaces throughout the surviving cells bear carvings, names, dates, and short inscriptions in Venetian dialect, some clearly legible. Others worn nearly to invisibility by centuries of humidity cycling through stone walls that were never designed to preserve anything. What makes the Piombi particularly disturbing is the specific psychological pressure the architecture itself was designed to apply. The cells sit directly beneath a metal roof in a lagoon city with brutal summer humidity, meaning prisoners experienced not merely confinement, but a controlled physical assault from the building itself. Temperature used as a deliberate instrument of suffering, long before modern interrogation techniques formalized the practice. Casanova described the heat as at times nearly unbearable, and inscriptions found in neighboring cells, believed to date from summer months based on associated Venetian court records, are noticeably shorter and less careful than those associated with winter imprisonments, as though the same conditions that eventually drove Casanova to attempt escape simply made sustained, careful carving physically impossible for other prisoners during the worst months. Venetian court archives, extensive and well-preserved compared to many other European states of the period, allow historians to match a number of the surviving Piombi inscriptions to specific documented trials, revealing that the cells held merchants accused of fraud, nobles caught in political intrigue, and clergy accused of unorthodox teaching. Alongside the more famous political prisoners history remembers, the range of crimes represented on a single stretch of carved wall illustrates just how broadly the Republic's justice system reached, sweeping ordinary disputes and genuine conspiracies into the same lead-roofed cells with equal severity. Casanova's own escape route, the specific ceiling breach he cut through, remains visible to visitors today, a physical hole in the historical record that one prisoner managed to open while so many others around him, carving names into the walls of adjacent cells, never found any way out at all. The truly haunting aspect of the Piombi is the asymmetry of what survived. One prisoner's escape became one of the most retold stories in European history, endlessly adapted, dramatized, and celebrated for centuries. The men and women held in the cells beside him, who left nothing but a name scratched into stone, and a court record in an archive nobody reads anymore, remain almost entirely unknown, despite having endured the exact same heat, the exact same walls, the exact same lead roof pressing down from above. Number 2, the Donjon of Château de Vincennes. On the eastern edge of Paris stands the Keep of Château de Vincennes, the tallest surviving medieval fortified structure in Europe, used across nearly 5 centuries as a state prison for individuals. The French crown considered dangerous enough to require the most secure confinement available in the kingdom. The list of prisoners held within its walls over that span reads like a cross-section of French intellectual and political history, including the philosopher Denis Diderot, held briefly in 1749 for writings the crown found subversive, and the Marquis de Sade, held for years in the 18th century before his eventual transfer elsewhere. The walls of Vincennes Donjon are covered floor to ceiling in some sections, with carvings spanning the entire operational life of the prison, meaning a single stretch of stone can contain graffiti separated by more than 200 years. Prisoners from wildly different centuries carving over, around, and directly beside marks left by people who died before they were even born. What makes Vincennes particularly unsettling is this compressed layering of unrelated human suffering, a physical timeline of French political repression, condensed into a handful of stone chambers, each new prisoner adding their own mark to a wall that was already, by the time they arrived, a centuries-deep archive of other people's despair. Diderot's brief imprisonment produced no known carvings, since his stay was relatively short and closely monitored. But later prisoners held in the same wing left extensive inscriptions, philosophical fragments, dates, and in several documented cases, what appear to be draft passages of longer works. Texts prisoners were composing in their heads and testing on the wall before, presumably, attempting to smuggle a cleaner version out on paper. Whether any of those smuggled versions survived elsewhere, matched against the carved fragments, remains an open question that researchers have only begun to investigate using the wall inscriptions as a starting point. Restoration efforts throughout the 20th century uncovered carvings in sealed sections of the keep that had been bricked over during later renovations. Chambers nobody realized still existed until structural surveys revealed voids behind newer walls. Inside those rediscovered spaces, carvings untouched by centuries of tourist traffic and previous restoration work remain in remarkably sharp condition, offering researchers a clearer window into prisoner conditions than anything visible in the more accessible sections of the fortress. One sealed chamber, reopened during a survey in the later 20th century, contained a wall almost entirely covered in a single repeated phrase, carved dozens of times in slightly varying handwriting, believed based on tool analysis to have been made by the same individual over an extended period rather than multiple prisoners. Historians studying the fragment have been unable to conclusively translate the phrase due to damage and archaic spelling, leaving the exact meaning and the exact desperation behind repeating it dozens of times on the same stretch of wall, permanently out of reach. The truly disturbing aspect of Vincennes is the sheer duration of its function. Most dungeons on this list operated as prisons for a matter of decades, sometimes a century. Vincennes held state prisoners for nearly 500 years, meaning the wall carvings inside its keep represent not a single moment of historical cruelty, but an unbroken, generational tradition of imprisonment, renewed under king after king, regime after regime, each one finding new reasons to fill the sandstone rooms with new names. Number 1, the Fortress of Château. On a small rocky island roughly a mile off the coast of Marseille sits Château, a fortress built in the 16th century to defend the harbor, converted almost immediately into a state prison, specifically because its isolation made escape appear functionally impossible, surrounded on all sides by open sea and strong currents that had already claimed experienced swimmers long before any prisoner attempted to test them. Huguenot prisoners, political dissidents, and later criminals of every description were held here across roughly 3 centuries, and the walls of the fortress's lower cells preserve one of the densest concentrations of prisoner graffiti found anywhere on the Mediterranean coast. What makes Château particularly disturbing is the specific despair embedded in carvings made by prisoners who could see freedom constantly, endlessly, and never reach it. Unlike inland dungeons where the outside world was simply invisible behind stone, the cells at Château include narrow openings through which prisoners could see the exact silhouette of Marseille across open water, close enough on clear days to make out the city's rooftops, the movement of ships, the ordinary lives of people who would never know they were being watched from a cell they would never leave. Conservators cataloging the cells have found carvings that explicitly reference the sea, crude depictions of waves and boats appearing far more frequently here than at comparable inland fortresses, alongside names, dates, and religious inscriptions consistent with the Huguenot prisoners held here during periods of intense religious persecution in the 16th and 17th centuries. Several cells contain tally marks running well into the thousands. A count that, if it represents individual days, implies imprisonment stretching across more than a decade for at least some of the men who left them. 19th century novelist Alexandre Dumas later used the fortress as the setting for a story of wrongful imprisonment and eventual revenge that became one of the most widely read works of fiction in the world. And the fortress today draws visitors largely because of that fictional connection. What most of those visitors never learn is that the real carvings on the real cell walls tell a far bleaker story than the novel does, since almost none of the actual documented prisoners held at Château d'If ever escaped at all. The fortress's reputation for impossible security was, unlike in the novel, entirely accurate. Archival records, matched against surviving cell inscriptions, have identified specific individuals held for religious nonconformity who were never formally tried, held indefinitely under royal order with no fixed sentence and no legal mechanism for release, meaning some of the names carved into these walls belong to people whose imprisonment had, officially, no end date at all. Only whatever length of time it took for illness, despair, or old age to finish what the sea already prevented them from escaping. The truly haunting aspect of Château d'If is the visibility of the freedom these prisoners were denied. Every dungeon on this list held people in darkness, in isolation, cut off from the world in ways that made captivity total. Château d'If did something crueler. It let its prisoners watch the world continue without them, framed in a narrow slit of stone, close enough to see, forever too far to reach, until the only thing left to do with that particular kind of suffering was carve it into the wall and hope, somehow, someone would eventually understand what they had been looking at. What connects all 10 of these dungeons isn't the darkness of the stone, or the age of the carvings. It's the same stubborn, universal instinct showing up again and again across centuries and countries and languages that shared nothing else in common. A duke painting a private universe onto plaster he'd never leave. A diver's tally marks scratched by starlight through a slit of window facing a city he could see but never reach. Brothers carving flowers into a wall as a coded message of loyalty days before an execution. People who had lost everything else still found a way to leave proof that they had existed, using nothing but a fingernail, a nail, a spike smuggled inside a book, or whatever pigment could be scraped together in total isolation. Every single mark on every single wall on this list represents someone who believed, against every available piece of evidence, that somebody, someday, would stand where they stood and read what they left. Most of the time, for centuries, nobody did. And then, by accident, through a restoration project, or a structural survey, or a piece of raking light hitting stone at just the right angle, somebody finally did. What else is still sitting in the dark right now? Carved into a wall. Nobody has thought to look at closely yet. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.